Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited to share that I recently launched 365 Days with Medieval and Renaissance Wonder Women. This immersive learning experience is much more than just an online course. Over 12 months in 2025, participants will come together and contribute to a supportive and inspiring online community of individuals who'll share in a unique learning experience, one that will ultimately deepen their understanding of the lives and experiences of medieval and Renaissance women. Together, we'll explore the contributions made by a variety of European women and celebrate, among other qualities, their courage, creativity, resourcefulness and resilience. I will guide participants every step of the way, but I'll also be joined by a stellar list of 28 contributors, including the brilliant broadcaster, best-selling author and Oxford academic Professor Janina Ramirez, who'll deliver the opening address. Head to my website onthetudortrail.com for further details, including a full list of sessions and presenters and testimonials from current participants. I do hope you'll consider joining me on this unique learning experience. I'd also, of course, like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love Talking Tudors and you never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors Patreon family. Please visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. When you join the community, you'll instantly unlock access to exclusive posts, including audio releases and videos. Patrons are also eligible to attend additional monthly live talks and to take part in a member-only book club. They can also enter patron-only monthly giveaways, to name but a few of the perks. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the podcast to talk about Anne Boleyn and the Queen's apartments at the Tower of London is Dr Owen Emmerson. Dr. Emmerson is a social and cultural historian and author of 4 books. He worked as the castle historian and assistant curator of Hever Castle for 6 years. He has appeared in 17 documentaries about the Tudor era, including The Boleyns, A Scandalous Family, and Blood, Sex and Royalty, Anne Boleyn. He's currently writing a full history of Hever Castle and a cultural history of the 10 Tudor queens. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Hello, Owen. Welcome back to Talking Tudors. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm very good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me back on. It's always an honour to talk to you and your wonderful subscribers.
Yes, and it has been a little while since you've actually been on the show. So would you mind just introducing yourself and just telling us all a little bit about you and your background?
Yes, of course. So I am a social and cultural historian. I am very much a 16th century historian, but I also love the 20th century. I have expertise in both areas. I worked for about 6 years at the wonderful Hever Castle as castle historian and assistant curator. I'm now a freelance historian. I work on several projects. I've got a few book projects on the go at the moment. I host online events, not least with yourself. And I am also a devoted Anne Boleyn geek. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, well, then you are perfect for this podcast, Owen. So I'm so glad that you're here. And I'm so excited actually to talk to you today about the now lost Queen's apartments at the Tower of London, because I've noticed a lot of people talking about these of late, probably because it is May. And lots of us are, of course, thinking about Anne Boleyn. It's kind of Anne Boleyn month. And of course, we know that she was and is associated with these apartments. So maybe before we dive in and look at those specifically, do you want to just tell us a little bit about the tower and the different functions that it's had throughout history?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're so right. I mean, the tower is sort of synonymous with Anne Boleyn's story, isn't it? I remember when I first visited the tower, I was probably about 5 years old. And I remember distinctly taking away from that visit the sense that the tower was this dreadful, bloody history site that really absolutely captured my imagination because of that idea of it. I really only saw it, I think, for a good part of my childhood as prison and a place of execution. And that is probably rooted in the fact that I did have a very unhealthy obsession with Anne Boleyn that hasn't really left me. And I do confess, actually, that when I visit the tower today, I still get sort of note of fear struck through my body when I see it for the first time. And I think that must have been the case for many, many people who observed the tower, not least the people that were unfortunate to be held prisoner and who lost their lives at that site. That feeling has never really gone. And I think it is part of the obsession that I have for the tower, that it has this ability to make me emote in certain ways. But my appreciation of the tower has grown significantly since that first visit. And so has my understanding of how versatile and varied the tower's history was. And I have to name a few names at this juncture because it is the works of Dr. Edward Impey, Dr. Jeremy Ashby, Dr. Anna Kay, Dr. Auden Gregory, and not least the wonderful Alfred Hawkins, who is a dear friend. He is an assistant curator of historic buildings at the Tower. And what that man doesn't know isn't worth knowing, essentially. He has inspired my love of the tower like no other. And he really has been able to sort of reshape my understanding of how the tower changed over time. There is this sort of traditional narrative, I would say, that the tower was first a fortress, then a palace, and then a prison. And that is helpful in one way, but it also does sort of hide the messiness of those overlapped identities, which often coexisted. And I think it also masks many of the tower's other really important functions too. Of course, the first great building at the tower was the White Tower, that amazing, iconic building, the Great Norman Stone Tower Keep, which is heralded still as the most complete 11th century palace in Europe. Building of that began in the 1270s and took upwards of 20 years to complete. It was followed by an inner ward, which was largely built under Richard I, and an outer ward, which was built under Edward I. Now, I mentioned that the tower likely struck fear into many people, but certainly not all, because for many, many people across its history, the tower was a home, and it still functions as one for many people today. And that's because the tower, throughout its history, held many institutions within it, such as the Royal Mint. The nation's coinage was created at the tower from the reign of Edward I right through until 1810. It also was a highly functioning armoury, a garrison, a public record office, a treasury, a menagerie, and later a zoo. So, I mean, this place had so many different identities, often coexisting at the same time, and it housed a great many of people who worked in these differing overlapping institutions. So I like to think now, having previously seen it as just this horror place, as a really multifaceted, diverse site, which shifted in function across time, but simultaneously elements of it remained remarkably the same throughout its history too. So you've got this wonderful blend of continuity and change at the tower, which is intoxicating to me.
It really is. It is such a fascinating place to visit. I think because of all those layers and those different functions, and it almost operated like a little mini town, didn't it? It would have
Yeah.
been really bustling with a lot of people at work, moving around. So it is an amazing site, I think, to visit because you can absorb all those moods, can't you? And all the different people that were there. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. And in terms of the Queen's apartments, so let's now focus a little bit on those. So when were they originally constructed? The ones that, the 16th century people would have known. And what did they look like? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of those buildings surrounding it as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we briefly discussed there the building of the inner ward around the White Tower, and then later the outer ward. But the royal apartments were constructed in what was known as the innermost ward. Now, this was formed in around 1220, and during the reign of Henry II, the inner ward really takes shape, and it has separate lodgings for both the king and the queen. These were constructed, including in between a vast great hall. Now, this would have been in appearance very similar to the Great Hall at Winchester. They are built very, very close together and by under the same king. But today, much of this is gone. In fact, the remaining palace buildings that can be visited today consist really of three towers to the south of the White Tower. They are St Thomas's Tower, the Lanthorn Tower, and the Wakefield Tower. Now, these three towers encompass what is left really of the royal apartments. They were built between the reigns of Henry III and Edward I, and they acted as specific parts of the medieval palace complex. They weren't the sum total of it. The Wakefield Tower, which is just to the southwest of the White Tower, was originally positioned right on the shore really of the Thames, and it also had a postern gate by it for access by barge. This later fell out of use. And this was likely an audience chamber for the king, whereas the Lanthorn Tower, which was positioned to the southeast of the White Tower, functioned as part of the Queen's lodgings. St Thomas's Tower, which is to the south, was built by Edward I between 1275 and 1279. And this functioned as a much larger Watergate entrance to the palace. Today we know it as Traitor's Gate, and it had a hall and chamber above it. So these are the still visible extant parts of that medieval palace that you can still go and visit today, and I would highly recommend that anyone does so. But so much of that palace complex is now missing. So that innermost ward, which was south of the White Tower, had a number of interconnecting buildings from it, from the 1200s, which formed this much larger palace complex. And it's those rooms that Anne Boleyn would have experienced her triumph and tragedy. The innermost ward was protected by a very high wall to the east, making it easily one of the most secure locations in that tower complex. And abutting to the southwest of the White Tower was a vast gatehouse known as Cold Harbour Gate, which would have been the entry point to the royal apartments. This is where Anne would have arrived for her coronation and also when she arrived as prisoner. If we travelled through that Cold Harbour Gate under its portcullis, the first buildings you would have seen would have been a series of lodgings, and these ran across the courtyard and sat next to the kitchens for the palace, which in turn sat southwest of a vast great hall that we've already mentioned. Now, the kitchens comprised of the Great Kitchen, the Lord's Kitchen, and the King's Privy Kitchen. And these would have been an absolutely bustling hive of activity. The King's Great Hall was built in the 13th century, and this occupied the southernmost aspect of that courtyard. And this really was, like any sort of palace or manor, the very heart of that medieval palace. And as I've mentioned previously, it would have appeared very similar in proportion and style to that which still exists at Winchester. I would so recommend anyone go and visit that great hall. I know you've been there, Natalie.
Amazing.
It's so evocative.
Yeah.
You know, it feels almost untouched, and the sounds and the smells of that place are so intoxicating. It
Yeah.
really gives you a sense of the scale and the splendor of those palace apartments. Now, Following on from the Great Hall, we would have entered into the King's apartments, and next to the Lanthorn Tower, which we mentioned, from there was a vast long gallery which led to the King's Council Chamber. So if we were to turn left from the Lanthorn Tower north towards the White Tower, this is the site of where the Queen's apartments was located. Now, this would have consisted of a great chamber, followed by a presence chamber, and carrying on north, we would have then led ourselves into the inner sanctum of the Queen's apartments, which contained a small oratory for prayer next to a closet, and then the Queen's privy chamber. Now, you've got to be someone of great importance to be received in the privy chamber. But beyond these rooms were also a double pile set of rooms, so two sort of galleries next to each other, as it were. This comprised of, to the right, the Queen's bedchamber, and to the left, her raying chamber. But the palace didn't stop there, although that's where the Queen's apartment stopped, because right up against the White Tower, where we're now located, to the left, to the west, that is the jewel house. That's where all of the jewels were kept. And we know that Henry VIII introduced the crown jewels to Anne at that site. And if we were to turn east, we would enter into the Great Wardrobe, which ran right to the inner ward walls. So you can get a sense here of the fact that this is a compact and very safe environment for the royal family to be situated in. You've got the outer ward, the inner ward, and then this innermost ward, which in and of itself is protected all around by not only walls, but the buildings themselves. So this sort of enclosed itself for protection and solitude, and therefore it was sort of the perfect site for the king and queen to be situated.
Absolutely, yes. And I think it later, of course, becomes the perfect prison site as well, because it is so kind of protected, isn't it? Which we'll get to in a little bit. But I believe, Owen, that there are some foundations of, well, I think definitely the Cold Harbour Gate, but is it the Wardrobe Tower that also has some foundations that you can see above ground?
Yeah, absolutely. So visitors to the tower today will be able to see that huge Cold Harbour Gate foundations. I mean, it really was vast when you look at the footprint of it, and it was a very tall, sort of two round towered affair. But yes, you can also see, in fact, the Roman wall. I got this bit of information from Alfred. We believe that the Queen's apartments were built on the footprint of the Roman wall, which was once situated there. So you can see both where the Queen's apartments and the Wardrobe Tower would have run along that historic site, which is quite amazing. So yes, I mean, it's a huge tragedy that these buildings don't survive, because so much of Anne's history happened. And the fact that they survived as long as they did was due to Anne's coronation, essentially, because they were almost certainly in a state of disrepair by the time that Anne was close to the throne, which I think we're going to talk about shortly.
Yes, absolutely. We are. We're going to look at some happier times as well. So you've already mentioned there's a connection here with Anne's coronation. So what refurbishments were made to these palaces? Because already they're quite kind of old, aren't they, by the time Anne comes to the throne? So what did they do in order to prepare for the coronation and the celebrations that would take place at the Tower?
Yeah, they really are. They're getting on, aren't they, by the time we get
Yeah.
to 1532, when it looks very certain that Anne is going to be the next queen. The last time that significant works had been carried out by the Office of Works at the Tower was in preparation for the joint coronation of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon. So it had been quite some time, actually, since any significant amounts of works had been done to this area of the palace. And Henry very rarely stays at the Tower thereafter. And I do have to wonder if it was because it was the site where his mother, Elizabeth of York, had died.
Yeah.
Did the Tower hold a different kind of significance for Henry? Because he really isn't located here very much during his reign at all. I think he maybe sees it also as a fortress rather than a palace per se. But there's something really important about tradition. And there's something really important about being seen to be doing the things that all kings and queens have done previously. So by 1532, the palace apartments were clearly in need of repair. And with that coronation on the horizon, the task of overseeing those works was given to Henry VIII's right-hand man, Thomas Cromwell. And under the auspices of the Office of Works with the carpenter James Needham. Now, in the National Archives today remain some really remarkable sets of 2 slim volumes, which show us what works were initially planned by the Office of Works during this period, and then that which was paid for and completed by them. This is so unbelievably helpful to get not only the survey, but also sort of the finances too. And there are pages and pages of entries here organised under the craftsmen responsible, from carpenters, bricklayers, plasterers, etc. They're all documented here. And they are our best source for the crucial repairs necessary to those royal apartments, from shoring up the king's apartments and the Great Hall to actually putting up new buildings for the Queen, all of which were required to make the building ready for not only the king and queen, but the court, the royal party, for the first time in decades. Now, the survey, the first part, is undated, but it was likely made just before the works commenced in the summer of 1532. And it really demonstrates, I think, that they probably ran out of time, because far more works were planned than were actually completed. So, for example, it was recommended that the Great Hall was in such a bad condition that it should be taken down and a new one built. That didn't happen. We know that huge amounts of works were done on the Great Hall. It was shored up, it was renovated, but I don't think there was time to build a whole new Great Hall. But the estimate for these really expansive works came in at an eye-watering £3,593, which is a vast fortune, let's face it. And Henry was not unused to spending vast amounts of money on Anne. And because of these works, Anne's coronation actually outshone that which he had afforded for himself and Queen Catherine. However, as I said, there was a scaling back of these plans, and I think that probably is likely due to time. But to get a flavour of kind of works that were completed, one aspect that I find really intriguing: for the first time, a door was added between the king and queen's chambers, which tells us something, I think, about the intimacy between Henry and Anne at this time. We know that a lock was crafted for it that Henry could access when he wanted, and perhaps that lock was fashioned by Henry Romain, who was the king's locksmith and created that beautiful Beddington lock, which resides in the Victoria and Albert Museum. That might give you a flavour, if people were to look at that beautiful lock, of what these fixtures might have looked like. They were exquisitely crafted. But it was the Queen's apartments that had the most significant works completed on them, with a whole new timber-framed dining chamber and great chamber, which was completely dismantled and rebuilt especially for Anne. This was a really significant work, and we know that the great chamber built for Anne was 59 feet long by 26 feet wide. It was really quite expansive. And this is the site where Anne would have entertained her guests. This space would also, thinking about what kind of atmosphere would have been in there, would have gained the most sunlight throughout the day, and with windows facing west. And it featured a dais at the end, and also had a beautiful, by all accounts, bay window overlooking the palace gardens. The gardens themselves, which sat to the east, would have been very formal gardens. They would have been decorated with heraldic devices, maybe even Anne's falcons and her leopards. And at the north end of this space was a newly created Jake, a closet for Anne's visitors to relieve themselves. It was a garderobe, essentially. So you can see that all of the added comfort has been thought about too, as well as the splendour. And it's likely that Anne's apartments would have been decorated very similarly to Henry's. And we know that this was decorated with wainscot panelling and painted in yellow ochre with Italianate antique work above, perhaps as a frieze. We know that the Great Hall was fully refurbished rather than rebuilt, and its vast oak ceiling was painted in yellow ochre too. I think this is a colour that we can actually
Yeah,
apply to Anne Boleyn on many, many occasions.
we can, yes.
We know that she has bed hangings in at least
Mm.
two palaces that are yellow.
Mm.
And it makes me wonder, Natalie, does this chime with the honeysuckles and
Mm.
acorns that are Henry and Anne's devices, their love devices, honeysuckle for Henry and acorn for Anne? It just makes me wonder if this is a colour scheme that matches this couple. Of course, green is heavily associated with the Tudor image
Yes.
anyway. So we know that also in the Great Hall, a dais was raised at the far end of it, and a new throne and cloth of estate was installed for Henry. But Natalie, I think the most redolent portal into these works remaining in situ today are the onion-shaped cupolas on top of the White Tower turrets, which were installed especially for Anne's coronation. I've had the very great privilege of seeing them up close thanks to Alfred Hawkins, and they truly are a complete marvel to behold and have become so iconic of the tower's profile. These were each capped by gilded vanes prepared by the Italian craftsman Ellis Carmen, and each turret upon which these onion-shaped caps were placed was actually raised at this point by 3 feet for added splendour. They really wanted these cupolas to pop and to be shown at their greatest advantage. I actually visited Mechlin, where we know Anne was stationed from around 1513 to 1514. And from the palace of Court of Savoy, where Anne was located, you can actually see a whole host in the distance of cupolas. And it just made me think for a moment, is this Anne bringing her style, her culture
Yeah.
to the Tower of London? It's a lovely thought. But yes, if you want a flavour of the scale and splendour of what those works look like, just look up at the White Tower and you will see just those remarkable remnants of those works. They were remarkable.
Goodness, I wish I could time travel and see all of that. It just sounds extraordinary. And I think one of the first things I do when I get there is always stare up at them at the White Tower and it's a really direct connection to Anne and to such a triumphant moment in her life. So I definitely like to do that. And just imagine, not just these incredible buildings, but then all the furnishings, no doubt embroidered with Anne's falcons. And they must have been absolutely everywhere in the gardens, in her apartments, in the stained glass on the windows. Oh, what I'd give to be able to see. It is such a pity that, we don't have those apartments anymore. Real
It
pity.
really is. Yeah, if
Goodness.
I could get any part of the tower back, it would just be those,
Yeah.
just that suite of rooms. Oh my
Oh,
goodness.
it would be amazing to see them. And so we know that, of course, Anne was there for her coronation celebrations. Can we place her there at any other time apart from obviously when she's imprisoned there? Do we have her visiting the tower?
Yeah, we do. So, as you've mentioned, Anne's most famous for staying there the night, the days before her coronation and also being held a prisoner. But we do know that Anne visited the tower before her coronation. And this isn't often spoken about, but she visited the tower in December 1532 to inspect the very works that we have just been talking about, just as she had visited Hampton Court whilst the works were going on there, whilst that amazing Great Hall, which still survives, was being created. That, of course, is still adorned with Anne's falcons. So we can imagine that those apartments, which are being rebuilt, must have had her devices throughout. I think Anne was a really great influence on Henry in terms of building. I'm certainly not the first person to say it. If we look at the works of Simon Thurley, we will see that Anne's influence was great. Henry really wasn't much of a builder
Mm.
before Anne Boleyn came on the scene, but the Boleyns were. And we only have to look at places like Blickling, which we think was completely rebuilt by Geoffrey Boleyn. Hever, which Geoffrey modified, which Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn modified. Newhall, which is refurbished and presented to King Henry VIII, which becomes the Palace of Beaulieu. Rochford Hall, which also had extensive building works completed on them by the Boleyns. These locations were sort of synonymous with being moulded into the Boleyn sort of identity, I think we can best put it. And I think Anne got that sort of inspiration, that craze for building. I think it was sort of in her DNA. But I think we also have to recognise that Anne has been lodged at places like the court of Margaret of Austria, which was the first sort of true Renaissance palace. She has been exposed to the most breathtaking interiors, the most sophisticated accommodations, and that was only furthered by her long stay in France and the many different palaces that she occupied there. So Anne is really bringing something new to the table here. We know that Catherine of Aragon was incredibly important in advancing cultural identity of England. I would say Anne's great intervention was being the builder. The Palace of Whitehall is so Anne Boleyn. The
Mm.
Great Hall at Hampton Court is so Anne Boleyn. And I think that these apartments, which Anne was actively inspecting in December 1532, would have had Anne all over them as well. I wish we had a more detailed explanation of what the interiors were actually like. We do have that to a degree with Henry's apartments, the modifications that he makes in 1532 to his apartments, but we don't quite have that detail with regards to Anne, which is very frustrating. But I do think, we have to consider Anne's sort of cultural background. And, as I say, Mechlin and those cupolas, I don't think there's a coincidence there. I can't prove it, but these, cupolas are also evidenced at the Palace of Whitehall. They're also evidenced at the Palace of Hampton Court, and they all emerge at this time. So I think we are getting a sense of Anne's spirit, her building spirit, if you like, with these renovations.
Absolutely. When you were talking there about the Boleyns, I was just thinking about it's so true what you were saying that it is in the Boleyn DNA. I think, making excellent marriages, number one.
Yeah.
And then number two, a really impressive property portfolio and how they built on that throughout the years is very Boleyn. So I think Anne definitely had that in her blood. And, her time in Europe must have just opened her eyes to all these incredible new ways of building and fashions that, of course, she must have, brought back with her when she came back. And I'm just thinking, Owen, that Acton Court, which is a location that Anne and Henry had earmarked to visit in 1535. And while it's not 100%, we're about 95% sure they did make a visit. But the preparations for that give us a sense as well what these apartments would have looked like, because they're, of course, furnished in order to impress Henry and Anne. And they're furnished in the latest fashions with Venetian glass that ended up, chucked into the moat later on, which is how we know.
Yeah.
So all beautiful Venetian glass, just all the textiles that would have dressed the rooms in incredibly bright kind of colors that may actually shock some of us now. I like everything muted, so I probably would have been like, wow, this is really bright. The frieze, of course, in their dining chamber that some say may actually have had a Holbein hand in that. And so you do get a sense of what these apartments would have been like. And then if you look at the Great Hall, of course, at Hampton Court, so it's like a puzzle, isn't it? You piece together,
it is.
You can begin to imagine the luxury, just the incredible luxury of these private rooms.
Oh, definitely so. And that's such a good, reminder of Acton Court. And, if you were to piece together that suite of rooms that's created especially for Henry and Anne's visit, and you were to abut it against the Great Hall at Winchester or at Hampton Court, you would get a flavour of what these apartments were like and what it would be like to progress through them. And you're so right to mention those friezes friezes. The Boleyns lived in splendor.
Yeah.
And, I think we really need to sort of take ourselves back to those locations, to Acton Court, to look at those beautiful friezes, how they would have been originally coloured, and get a sense that these weren't sort of dark panelled rooms. The fact that we know that the King's Great Hall at the Tower had a yellow ochre ceiling. I mean, you never see that in films, do you? You never see that bright, sort of striking colour. It's always dark wood, as if it had always been thus. But, these were very elaborate, beautifully, highly skilled craftsmen working on them. And, yeah, I would not be surprised if Holbein wasn't involved in some of the planning of the decor as well. We know how heavily involved he was in the planning of the pageants for Anne's coronation. So one can only imagine.
Yes, I know. I think that sort of dark paneling has become synonymous with the Tudors, but in fact, you only need to sort of see the oak when it's first, used to see that it would have, even if there hadn't been any painting or any tapestries, that it's so much lighter and so much brighter. And I know we've seen it somewhere, but I can't now remember the location where we commented on the fact that, wow, look at the difference in the color when it hasn't been treated and painted over the centuries.
At Penshurst in the long gallery there, the paneling hasn't.
It makes a huge difference, doesn't it? It's bright. It's a whole different kind of space, and it would have been very colourful and very bright. And I feel like the yellow ochre I've also seen in building works at other palaces, Greenwich perhaps. So I do think it was possibly a favourite colour of Anne's in terms of decorating, interior decoration, because we definitely see it at other palaces as well. So they're little glimpses, aren't they, into her taste, which I find really, really lovely to talk about and to hear about. So, Owen, a lot of the times when I talk about these apartments and I say now lost, people don't quite understand that. How do these incredible apartments that you've just described, these buildings that cost thousands of pounds, just disappear? How does that happen?
It's remarkable, isn't it? And I think the answer begins and ends with Anne Boleyn. The last hurrah of this site really is Anne's coronation in 1533. And Anne does stay in the apartments before her coronation. She leaves them for her coronation procession and is crowned the next day. Of course, no one could have foreseen it, but those beautiful rooms would become her prison, and she would return to that site, retracing her steps exactly less than 1,000 days later. She would be taken back on the 2nd of May and would be imprisoned in her palace in the rooms created especially for her. There is something really psychologically troubling about that for me. And of course, it wasn't a long stay. By the 19th of May, she was dead and arguably has never left the tower. She is buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, although the whereabouts of her burial place is hotly contested.
It is.
More to come on that at a future date, I hope. But yes, I think the brutality, the shock, the horror of what happened during that time was sort of the death knell of those palatial rooms. They would never be used as extensively again. Now, we do know that they are used for coronation purposes. It was traditional for the monarch, king or queen, to reside at the tower. So they were used sparingly, but by 1597, we get a wonderful plan of the tower by Hayward and Gascoigne. And we can clearly see that by that point, the Great Hall, although it was refurbished and not rebuilt during Anne's coronation refurbishments, had fallen into disrepair. Indeed, it is noted on the map as decayed, and you can see that it has fallen in, essentially. And most of the Tudor palace of that 16th century refurbishment was demolished during an extensive remodelling in the 1660s, and any other remaining parts that had been incorporated into other buildings were lost during the 18th and 19th centuries, when more rebuilding work was carried out. So you have this gradual decline, essentially. The tower really does cease to be a palace after Anne's coronation. It is used for ceremonial purposes by the royal family, that is. It's used extensively by other people. But I think the spilling of Anne's blood stained the tower.
Yeah.
And, it does function as another person's prison. I think we're going to be talking about that shortly. But it almost certainly was used to house Thomas Cromwell at one point in his time in the tower when he was completing some of the final details that would lead to the annulment of the marriage of Cleves. And we also know that someone very close to Anne stayed in those apartments too.
Yes, it does sort of feel like following Anne's execution. Of course, she's not the first person imprisoned there or executed there. However, it feels like there's a lot more people imprisoned following Anne's execution, suddenly prominent people. So the association more with the prison, I think, gets enhanced, and the palace kind of not so much. Obviously none of the other Tudor queens consort are crowned. So we don't know whether they would have stayed in the same apartments, whether they would have been refurbished again. But it is interesting that now this identity as a prison really increases. So amazingly, and I always say you just can't make this story up, really, can you? Elizabeth,
Nope.
of course, is also imprisoned at the Tower by her half-sister, Queen Mary. And we think Owen is housed in the same apartments as her mother.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, from documentary evidence, we aren't told precisely where Elizabeth was held. And traditionally, it was the bell tower, which we have had the privilege of visiting, with a little walkway known as Princess Elizabeth's Walk, identified and promoted actually during the Victorian era as the site of where Elizabeth was held. But it is thanks actually to the research of two amazing historians and dear friends, Dr. Nicola Tallis and Dr. Tracy Borman, that have demonstrated that it was almost certainly the Queen's apartments where Elizabeth was held prisoner. And this was, some really groundbreaking work, I think, by Tracy and Nicola, both making the case that there was nowhere else available, essentially, that was suitable to hold Elizabeth in the wake of Wyatt's rebellion. You have to imagine that after a rebellion of that kind, the tower was rather busy, functioning quite heavily as a prison. So I think they make a really compelling argument for that being the location. Something else that sort of compounds it for me is the fact that she's released on the anniversary of Anne's execution, which must have been particularly challenging for Elizabeth. And it feels almost purposeful psychologically, a psychologically driven motive to lodge Elizabeth in that location and then to release her on that date. So, we can just only imagine how awful it must have been to place Elizabeth there. And I think it is very likely that it was that location. I can't see it being anywhere else, frankly. Those rooms have barely been used since her mother's horrific downfall. And compounding this, when Elizabeth arrives at the tower, she very likely entering those royal apartments would have encountered the bloody scaffold used to execute her very young cousin, Queen Jane. This must have been one of the most challenging periods of Elizabeth's life, and I think it shaped the woman that she was. So, yeah, I can't ever really get my head around how horrific that must have been, but I do think it's very important to focus on it because I do think it shapes Elizabeth's character. I think it forms the kind of queen that she becomes.
And so interesting, Owen, when you consider the fact that Anne was pregnant with Elizabeth when she was there for her coronation. So Elizabeth spent time, technically, with her mother there. And obviously her mother was thinking about her while she was there in that incredibly triumphant moment. And then in the darkest of days, where, of course, her daughter wasn't with her, but she would have been thinking of her. And we know she was thinking about her family. There is a psychological element that is slightly cruel. I don't know whose idea it was. We're not going to point fingers, but I do think there is something purposely cruel and calculating about imprisoning her in those apartments and releasing her on the end. That cannot be a coincidence on the anniversary of Anne's execution. I do think Elizabeth probably thought she would end up on the scaffold as well. I can't see how she thought anything else. That what a traumatic period for her. So, of course, people listening might be thinking, or might have done one of the great tours of the tower and have been told that Anne was kept and imprisoned in that lovely set of black and white houses there on the green that were originally the Queen's house, that I think are now the King's house. So when does this association with Anne and those surviving buildings begin, and who perpetuated this story?
Yeah, I think we've all probably been told that in our youth, especially when we're having a guided tour. I think this is emerged when the tower really sort of took hold as a visitor attraction. And we know that there was a rather spurious room that was furnished in what is now called the King's House. Historically, it's been called the Queen's House, but we now have a king, where there is some ye olde panelling installed, a four-poster bed with Henry's head on it installed too, and the name Anne carved into a lintel on the windowsill. So this was very purposeful fabrication on the part of perhaps a Victorian custodian who wanted to give visitors what they wanted to see. There's not much of a yarn to be told to point over to a blank green and say that's where Anne Boleyn was held prisoner. People wanted to inhabit the space. They wanted to experience what Anne Boleyn experienced. And, it's for that reason that many of the sites are marked out at the tower for the first time, actually on the orders of either Queen Victoria or her husband, Prince Albert, for Victoria. So we know that the site of the scaffold is marked out for the first time. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily where the executions took place. They probably took place in various places on Tower Green, which was much larger then. But we also know that's when Anne's grave, or what was believed to be Anne's grave, was marked out for the first time after an extensive refurbishment of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, when many bodies were exhumed. So I think we can probably date this tradition to around then. And it was very much sort of solidified in Harrison Ainsworth's The Tower of London, which told the story of Lady Jane Grey, and also in his book of Windsor Castle, where Anne is definitely touted to have resided in this particular building, which wasn't completed until the 1540s, unfortunately. It remains a beautiful and unique timber frame building. I think it's the oldest one standing in London. I might be wrong, but I have a feeling that it's certainly one of the oldest surviving in the city of London. So you can see why this myth emerges. It's due to the fact that tourists want to see the sites where this history happened. And I think we can forgive them for creating a bit of mythology and giving historians a sense of glee when they can point out that it's wrong, because who doesn't enjoy that?
No, exactly. I think you're right. I think it is about making a tangible link to the past. And, not all of us can visualize when we're standing in empty spaces and think, oh, this is where they
Yeah.
are from. That's where, so it is, of course, much easier when you're looking at something or standing in a room. I do remember seeing a documentary actually filmed in that room that you've mentioned. I think it was Professor Ives, the wonderful Professor
Yes,
Ives. And I can't remember who he was talking to now, but I'm sure they were in that room that you're
that's
referring to.
right. Yeah.
I think it might still be on YouTube, to look up and
Yeah.
have a look at. So it is fascinating, really, isn't it? And so the last question I have for you, Owen, you've been so generous with your time already, but what are your favorite things to see at the Tower? What should everyone look out for when they're there?
Oh, my goodness.
So many.
I would try and do this as succinctly as possible. But I think my favorite parts are those that are associated with Anne,
Yeah.
for obvious reasons. So I love starting my visit by going to the Queen's Steps, which are just west of Traitor's Gate, which is where Anne would have landed, both as a queen to be and as a prisoner, and look over to the Bywood Postern, which is the drawbridge that she would have crossed, and through the postern gate into the tower. That was Anne's route. I love the White Tower. I think it's just breathtaking. There's nowhere like the White Tower. It's one of the most beautiful and striking and imposing buildings that I've ever occupied. I adore the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. I think it was described as one of the saddest places on earth, I think, by someone who said it more eloquently than I just have. But I adore it. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And if you ever get the chance to listen to Alfred Hawkins talking about the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, then do it, because there is nothing that he doesn't know about that place. And he cares for it in a way that I find absolutely amazing. So yeah, there are many sites. I mean, if you want to stand where Anne was executed, you need to go to the north side of the White Tower, probably just in front of where the entrance to the Jewel House is. The scaffold probably stood somewhere around there. And she was in the shadow of those beautiful onion-shaped cupolas that were installed for her coronation. Take a moment to really absorb those wonderful extant features. There's nothing quite like seeing them in person. And, you know, if you can take anything away from your visit, make it be like a few minutes gazing at those wonderful domes, because they set my heart ablaze every time I see them. I think they're smashing and so Anne Boleyn.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? And I visit every time I'm in London, and there's always something new that I haven't seen
Oh,
before,
yeah,
or a different perspective that I haven't, considered, or even just a different view. If you just pause at a different spot and look out over the Thames or look in the other direction, look towards Tower Hill, there's always something,
exactly.
isn't there? Something fresh that can come, a fresh insight, I think, from that. So it is an incredible place, and I think it's a must see, once in your lifetime if you can possibly get there. It's incredible. And so before I let you go, Owen, I ask all my guests for a Tudor takeaway. So this is something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. You've already given us lots of things to think about, but do you have a final Tudor takeaway for us?
I do, and it's related to another site that is very dear to my heart indeed. I'd find it very difficult to choose between the tower and this location, and that is, of course, lovely Hever Castle. They are launching this summer, in fact, on the 26th of June, a wonderful new experience, and that is a complete recuration of the Boleyn apartments. This is a suite of 4 rooms, very similar to what we've just been talking about with the Tower of London. These rooms are perhaps the only extant suite of rooms that were occupied by the Boleyn family as a whole that survive. I can't think of any other suite of rooms like this. It's the west elevation of Hever Castle. And thanks to the wonderful work that has been done by the brilliant historian, assistant curator and castle historian Kate McCaffrey, they are returning these suite of rooms to how they would have been during the Boleyn's tenure. I was involved in this at the beginning. Of course, I've moved on now, but I have been kept up to date with Kate's amazing progress, and it's going to be a showstopper. I am so proud of the work that Kate has done on this. It's so embedded in the kind of historian that she is. The attention to detail is exquisite. I've had little sneak peeks every now and again, and you aren't going to want to miss it. I think people struggled in the past actually to appreciate that they were in the very same rooms that the Boleyns occupied, because William Wardorf Astor had put up slightly boring paneling, shall we say, and in the Edwardian era, and it kind of masked, I think, the flavour of vibrancy and vitality that the Boleyns would have been surrounded by. So you can expect, beautiful painted ceilings, gilded ribs, painted friezes returning to Hever, tapestry wall hangings, rush matting. It is going to be an intoxicating, heady experience. And I think everyone, if you can get to Hever to see this new experience, you will not regret it.
Oh, it sounds incredible, and I cannot wait to see it later in the year. I think that will be a highlight, certainly, of my Tudor life anyway. We'll be seeing the
Absolutely.
Boleyn apartments. And what I love about them is, of course, because it's quite intimate. The space is intimate.
Yeah,
It's not kind of a great hall at Hampton Court. It's a much smaller space. So you know that you are literally walking in their footsteps, their exact
totally.
footsteps when you walk through those rooms. So I'm so excited to see the work that Kate's done and the team's done. I'm sure going to be absolutely absolutely mind-blowing. So a must-see for all Boleyn fans out there. And hopefully for people that, aren't able to travel over, perhaps there'll be some element, Owen, of something on the website that they might be able to look at. Obviously not the same, but you still will get a little taste of those Boleyn apartments. So, watch this space and we'll keep you updated if anything like that happens as well. But this has been such a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast and talking Tudors with me.
Such a joy. Thank you for having me again.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.